G'day everyone, and welcome to the 15th Agony Anth, part of my collaboration with the Charles Darwin University Law Student Society. This week I've been asked to explain how you can avoid accidental or unintentional plagiarism. You've probably been hearing about plagiarism since high school, and you would certainly have had it drummed into you over and over that plagiarism is forbidden at university. The stakes, however, are particularly high for law students, more so than for other university students. You see, if you're penalised for academic misconduct, which usually means plagiarism or other forms of cheating, this is something you will be required to disclose in your application for admission. It will often be enough for your application to be refused or subject to conditions. As a result, it's important not to just take the plagiarism rules for granted. Now, in this video, I'm not going to be discussing actual cheating. If you're taking someone else's ideas for your own, or you're paying for essays to be ghostwritten, or if you're working in groups on tasks which are meant to be completed individually, then that's just straight up cheating. And any student who cheats on their fellow students deserves the full consequences. End of rant. What I do want to talk about is inadvertent or accidental plagiarism. This happens where someone ends up breaking the rules of plagiarism without ever intending to cheat. In legal terms, this is more a matter of academic negligence than intentional cheating. It happens in a number of ways. First, it sometimes happens when there is an error in your citations. Now, a certain amount of common sense has to be applied here. If you're citing a journal article, and instead of listing your quote as being from page 347, you list it as being from page 374, this is technically plagiarism because you haven't correctly cited your source. However, this sort of thing is really not likely to be dealt with as plagiarism. If your marker follows up the source and realises the error, and yes, markers do sometimes follow up those sources, then you'll likely be marked down for a sloppy citation rather than anyone accusing you of academic misconduct. A more sinister type of sloppy citation occurs when you're reading a case, say, and the case quotes from another case. It's a great quote and you chuck it into your paper citing the original case, even though that's not where you found it. That's edging towards dishonesty because it's kind of like you're pretending that you did more work than you really did. The bottom line, though, is that you have an obligation to be careful with your citations because a failure to properly cite work can be cheating. That one's easy because it's just a matter of paying enough attention to detail. While we're talking about citation, never, ever, ever cite your lecture notes, course materials, or Wikipedia in your assignments. Obviously, you can't plagiarise those sources. If you're going to quote from them, then the correct citation should be given. But you shouldn't. Citing your lecture notes or Wikipedia is like admitting that you couldn't be bothered doing any actual research. You're expected to go out and find sources for the things that you say in your assignments. So, our first type of inadvertent plagiarism is a citation error. The second type is called self-plagiarism. Self-plagiarism is actually a deliberate type of plagiarism, but it often occurs in circumstances where students have no idea that they're doing anything wrong. Self-plagiarism occurs when you reuse material that you have already submitted in a previous assessment. So, for instance, let's say you do an honours thesis on the same topic as one of your assignments, or you strike it lucky and one of your subjects has a very similar assessment to one that you completed back in your high school legal studies. You can't use that earlier work. Every piece of assessment which you submit has to be original work, except where cited. So resist the temptation to lift things from earlier work you might have submitted. The final type of inadvertent plagiarism I want to talk about is probably the most important one. They call this mosaic plagiarism or substitution plagiarism. And lots of people don't realise that it's plagiarism at all. Let's say you're reading in your textbook and it says, one feminist critique of the common law centres around the concept of so-called objective tests based on the reasonable person. Feminist argument suggests that for centuries the reasonable person was in fact a reasonable man, and that these standards are not in fact objective but gendered at their very heart. Now, we know you can't just cut and paste that into your assignment. But what if you substitute some words so that you're not simply copying? You might rewrite the paragraph this way. One feminist criticism of the common law focuses on the idea of so-called objective tests based on the reasonable person. Feminists suggest that historically the reasonable person was in fact a reasonable man, and that these standards are not actually objective but gendered fundamentally. Can you see how it's now written differently, but the problem is still there? It's someone else's idea, someone else's thought, and all you have done is shown that you understand how synonyms work. It's still plagiarism because whoever wrote that idea first is not being acknowledged. A second type of mosaic plagiarism occurs when the student goes further than just word substitution and moves entire groups of words around. Something like this. So-called objective tests in the common law are criticised by feminist writers who suggest that these standards are not in fact objective but are gendered at their very heart. Historically, the reasonable person was in fact a reasonable man. Again, it's fundamentally someone else's idea, someone else's work. The student in this case hasn't done any real work, they've just shuffled sentences around. It's cheating. And the stupid thing about it is that it could so easily be fixed simply by acknowledging the source. Now, some of you are quite perplexed right now because you take a lot of notes when you read, and then you refer to those notes when you write your assignment. And in your mind, all you're doing is referring to your notes. Well, the difficulty is those notes record someone else's work and someone else's thoughts. In your assignment, attribution needs to be given. So when you take those notes, record the sources. And if you use those notes while writing assignments, note the sources. The final type of inadvertent plagiarism is genuinely accidental, where you write something which you have learned and you honestly believe is coming straight from your own mind, whereas in fact it's something that you read or something that you heard. This can be the hardest type of plagiarism to prevent, not just academically either. I've heard that when Paul McCartney of the Beatles first thought up the melody for the beautiful song Yesterday, he thought there was no way such a beautiful melody could be original. He must have heard it somewhere else. So he went around humming it to his friends, all of whom told him it was original and beautiful. The only way to avoid this genuinely accidental plagiarism is to make sure that when you're writing an assignment, every single point of real substance must be supported by an authority or a source. The less that you claim as being your own, the less chance there is of inadvertently plagiarising. Finally, I'm often asked how we as lecturers detect plagiarism. Frankly, it's often ludicrously simple. Sure, there are electronic tools like Turnitin and good old Google. However, it's really hard for students to hide a sudden change in authorial voice. Suddenly, halfway through an assignment, the language and expression changes. The writing goes from less professional to more professional. The grammar goes from simple to complex. It's like being in a conversation with someone who suddenly changes their tone towards you. You might struggle to actually tell what's changed specifically, but you know something has. One time, I actually had a student plagiarise me from an article I'd written in an assignment I was marking. The mind boggles. Whenever you submit an assignment, remember that a fair chunk of the marks actually comes from the research. Including citations is a way of showing the marker the research that you actually did. There's absolutely nothing to be gained by pretending that the work is your own. For most students, plagiarism is never really an issue. Take a bit of care and I promise you'll be fine. But remember, the lecturers tracking down plagiarists are actually doing a favour to all those students who really are doing the right thing. I really hope you're having as much fun with Agony Anth as I am. Please keep the questions coming, and I'll see you again real soon.